A woman is dragged from her house in a little rural hamlet in Germany. A crowd of people stands in the mud shouting, "Witch, witch, witch!" As she's tied to a post, a hooded figure appears, looking something like a medieval painter and decorator. He ain't no painter. If you've been watching our punishment series of shows over the last few years, you'll know that the past was a pretty grim place for a lot of people accused of crimes. But it should be said that sometimes the horrors of history are exaggerated or even made up. Still, did the Romans have elephants squash people for fun? Yes. Did the ancient Chinese flay a woman's face over a conspiracy in a harem? Yes, they did. Did the British open up a man's stomach, pull out his guts, chop off his manhood, and remove all his limbs in the name of justice? Yes, and what's more, the crowd loved it, as just many Americans today love Super Bowl Sunday. Punishments back then were often public events. That's why they usually took place in the town square or close to the market. If you were a traitor or even a purveyor of your own body, execution or torture days were good for the business. Witches really drummed up a crowd. People would travel for miles to see a witch being punished in the town square. Usually, when there was a witch weekend, the punishment for the accused woman would be to be put in the pillory. When women or men were pilloried, often the crowd would come and throw mud or feces at them. Sometimes stones were used. That would rearrange a person's face or kill them. All of this is documented. You have absolutely no reason to disbelieve stories that contain information about people being brutalized in the past by authorities or dumb mobs. Still, when we tell you about a torturer that used a lawn tool from hell, you'd probably be skeptical. Let's investigate the matter. If it existed, the spiked hair could come in a couple forms. One form was the stationary spiked hair, and the other was a handy transportable spiked hair that a torturer could take with him to the market square to get a witch to admit she turned a neighbor into a slug. It was basically a roller attached to a stick. That roller was covered with spikes. If you've ever worked in the landscaping business, you might have seen a similar tool called a lawn spike aerator. Instead of popping holes in the grass, the spiked hair would put holes in a person's skin. If this device was rolled over the victim a number of times, it could lead to an infection and death, especially given the fact that torture devices weren't generally sterilized during the medieval period. The second version of the punishment was the stationary one. Now the rollers were on top of some boards, kind of like a conveyor belt. The person could just be pulled over the top of the rollers, or in some cases, the machine would also work as a stretching rack. In that case, the person's limbs could be dislocated while their skin was shredded. All that for just telling a bunch of friends in the tavern that you thought the king had a rather big nose. Very gruesome indeed. But in a world with breast rippers and head crushers, the spiked hair was no more out of place than the sound of roosters crowing in the morning. Nonetheless, what we need is proof it was used. That's actually hard to come by. It gets a mention in a book we found. That was a 1767 dictionary written by a German guy named Johann Theodor Jablonski. That dictionary was called the General Lexicon of Arts and Sciences. In it, the spiked hair punishment is described, except the translation from German is pecked hair. According to the dictionary, it's a roller with small pointed pegs stuck around it. This is placed under the patient's back when he's stretched out on the bench and pulled back and forth. The reason the device was called the spiked hair was that people, when they would cook a hare over a fire, would often stab it to make little holes in it so it would cook thoroughly. A person who's been rolled with the device would end up looking like a spiked hair. It isn't mentioned in too many texts, but we found another book that mentions it. The book was written in 1859 and called The Witch Trials of the Two Cities of Braunsberg. The author, Jacob Aloy von Lindenthal, writes, translated from German, Spanish boots, spiked rabbits, and similar designations of the tools of torture, if not to mockery, but rather to a cruel joke that was allowed against the unfortunate victims. In the book, The Witch Hunt from Freiburg, 4th episode, From the Torture of Torture to a Valid Confession, the spiked hair devices with iron spikes are discussed, although that book suggests that the stationary versions of the device were the most in vogue. In a book titled Torture, Persuasion at its Most Gruesome, it's written that victims of torture would sometimes be strapped into what was called the German chair. The author writes that the chair itself, being studded with spikes, was painful enough, but if his bed of nails didn't prove sufficient to extract a confession from the victim, then the spiked hair was pulled out. Another book, History of the German People at the Close of the Middle Ages, echoed that statement, stating that the rolling pin of pain was used when other tortures had not produced results. The book says, with instruments of this sort for extorting confessions, it is no wonder that many quite innocent people should have pleaded guilty in order to escape the agonies of torture. The book refers to a case in 1570 in the German city of Frankfurt on the Main. The victim apparently went through all the various tortures the authorities had in their arsenal, but he refused to admit to being part of any crime. The last resort for the torture torturers was using a live rat that was placed under a bowl on the victim's flesh, so the creature would eat into the man's wounds. The author doesn't say what happened after that. The book cites a writer of the time named John Grievous, who wrote, "There are nowadays more kinds of torture than there are limbs to the human body." With that in mind, while there aren't too many historical sources talking about the spiked hair, there's no doubt the authorities, at least in Germany, could have resorted to using such a thing. Now you need to watch Waterboarding, Worst Punishment in the History of Mankind, or have a look at this.